I'm really excited to host Sharon as she's going to speak about her book that comes out officially June 7th, next week, called Real Love. And Real Love is her 10th book, which is quite a feat in itself. So a couple things about Sharon before we get started. Sharon is a longtime meditator and practitioner of mindfulness. And Sharon is a leading expert and renowned expert in the field for being in a mindful state, whether it's leading meditational sits or workshops or seminars. I think she does everything pretty much. So it's really exciting to have her here today. And I think with that, I'll hand it over to Sharon, who's going to share about what we're going to cover today, and we'll take questions at the end. Thank you, and welcome, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so lovely to be here again. I was actually at Google once, and Bill Duane was introducing me, and he said, Sharon is an OG. So I said, what's that? And he said, original gangster. I said, oh, okay. Referring to not only my age, but that I had gone to India kind of early in that wave. I went in 1970 and came back as a meditation teacher in 1974. So kind of preceded a lot of current interest in the popularization of these qualities and the methodologies of meditation, mindfulness, and now increasingly loving kindness and compassion, which is really what I've specialized in a way, although I teach a lot of mindfulness. I don't know if I am mindful all the time, as Rachel said, but I do teach it a lot. And sort of in that evolution, my own evolution, where I started out using methods of meditation to try to be more aware and to understand myself more, and really, frankly, to be a lot happier than I was. I was 18 years old when I went to India, and I was a junior in college, and I went through a university program, and that, of course, was why I went, because I looked around where I was going to school, and I just didn't see the actual how-to, the ways to meditate, to bring it to life anywhere, and it took that kind of journey in those days. So I've been really interested to sort of watching this wave happen and realize, like, you don't have to go anywhere anymore if you don't want to. And look at that. What does that mean for us here and now? So I started with mindfulness practice, which was enormous for me. And I also heard that there were different techniques available that would emphasize qualities like loving kindness and compassion. So loving kindness is a really odd term, I know. And it's not, generally speaking, the kind of term you hear people talking about casually somewhere, and that makes me concerned that might make the quality itself seem somewhat arcane and removed from day-to-day life. Like, what is that? Like something quaint, something sort of sanctimonious or something like that. But actually, it's meant to be a live, vital sense of connection, to not feel so isolated, not to isolate others, to have a sense of being a part of a greater whole. As one friend of mine quipped as we were driving along somewhere, caught in terrible traffic, and they were, complaining bitterly about the traffic, and the traffic was so wretched and it was so terrible. And then they paused and said, I guess we're the traffic too. Like, what's it like when we're not considering ourselves separate and apart in those ways, where the kind of constructs of self and other and us and them with a great big other out there are seen as constructs. They may be useful, they may be inappropriate in certain situations, but they're just constructs. The reality is that we live in an interconnected universe, and here we are, right? It's a world that's pointing to that all of the time, but our values, our behavior, don't always reflect that truth. And so being able to see more clearly, to see more accurately, to see the interconnected nature of things is one of the strongest ways to leap into a sense of loving kindness. Just honoring that state of connection. loving kindness or love, in this case, since I'm now using the word love, doesn't mean you like everybody. It actually doesn't even mean you necessarily like anybody. But we do understand our lives have something to do with one another. It's a deep, deep acknowledgement that we do live in this kind of world of connection, in effect that we are all the traffic. I have a friend, Bob Thurman, who's a professor of Buddhist studies at Columbia University, and he uses this image a lot, which I think I use much more than he does, where he says, imagine you're on a subway and these Martians come and they zap the subway car so that those of you who are there are going to be together forever. He says, what do? Like if somebody's hungry, you feed them. If somebody's freaking out, you try to calm them down. Not because you necessarily like them or you approve of them, but because you're going to be together forever. So guess what? There's a lot of truth to that. So this notion of interconnection isn't always like, it's not sentimental, it's not saccharine, sweet, it's not even very nice sometimes. But it is that fundamental recognition that what happens over there doesn't nicely stay over there. It really ripples out over here. And what we do, where we put our energy, what we care about, it matters because it's going to ripple out in just that same way. And here we are in a world where science is showing us this, and economics is showing us this, and certainly environmental consciousness is showing us this. Even epidemiology is showing us this. Here we are. And can our lives actually reflect that truth in deeper and deeper ways? So sometimes when I tell that story about Bob, I go on to tell this story. I was in New York City once, sitting on an airplane, trying to get to Tucson, and the plane sat on the tarmac for about 4.5 hours. In what, looking back, I sometimes now call the breakdown of civilization, because it was getting hotter and hotter, and people were getting angrier and angrier and screaming and yelling, like, get me off this plane. And I wasn't feeling all that chipper myself, sitting there thinking, I'm paying rent in New York City. If they'd only let me off the plane, I could go home and try again tomorrow. At one point, the pilot sort of took command of the aircraft. He got on the PA system and he said, no one is getting off this plane. So I was sitting there and not feeling very good. And then all of a sudden, that image of Bob's that I had used so often in teaching came up in my mind. Like, imagine you're on a subway and these Martians come and they zap the subway car so that those of you who are there are going to be together forever. And I looked around the airplane and I thought, maybe these are my people. Here we are, maybe forever. And I realized in that moment a good deal of my ire was this feeling of like, how long am I stuck with you? And it's like, oh, forever, deal, right? This is it. How are we going to deal with one another? And that very much is the sensibility I bring into the practice of loving kindness meditation. We can develop deepened qualities like compassion and self-compassion and understand them, which is very important, and really explore those qualities in lots of different ways. Obviously, life lends us a lot of opportunities, just every day. Doing a simple method of meditation, like putting your attention on the feeling of the breath, some object like that, and having to continually return your attention to that object will deepen the qualities of loving kindness and first self-compassion, which will blossom out into compassion for others. Because there's actually no way to do it successfully without that deepening. Even if it's never voiced, it's never articulated, it's never named. That's what we're actually doing. So I got to India and I first learned meditation in the context of an intensive 10-day retreat. That's how I started. And the first instruction I was given was sit down and feel your breath. And first of all, I was very disappointed. I thought, feel my breath. I came all the way to India. Where's the magical, esoteric, fantastic technique that's going to transform my whole life? I thought, feel my breath. I could have stayed home to feel my breath. And then I thought, how hard can this be? It's going to be a snap. Well, it wasn't that easy. I thought, okay, what'll it be? Like 800 breaths, 900 breaths before my mind starts to wander. And to my astonishment, it was like one breath or two breaths. and I would be gone. I'd be way gone. And then comes the magic moment where you think, been some time since I last felt a breath. And I was told over and over and over again, but did not believe that that was actually the critical moment in the whole process, because that's the moment of being able to be different. Instead of judging yourself and being harsh and feeling like a failure and spending the next 4 hours, say, just in that rant about yourself, thereby extending the period of the distraction and leaving yourself exhausted and demoralized, we learn how to let go. Just let go gently, what one of my teachers called exercising the letting go muscle, and we learn how to begin again. Just let go and come back. And that coming back is an expression of self-compassion, because the nearly overwhelming temptation is just to go on that rant, and to get lost in that. And this is a chance to be different, which is a challenge, right? The building block of that difference is some kindness towards yourself. And the reason I said it's so important to understand it is because that doesn't mean being lazy or not having standards of excellence or not having an edge, not having commitment. It's actually a pretty radical notion of what is the best way to succeed and make a change and learn something new. Because think of all that time we spend in those rants and think of how we feel at the end. So that's why we say that meditation is a practice of resilience. So that's a tremendous way, whatever process we do, of kind of building that almost unspoken but known sense of loving kindness. We practice through insight, through understanding, through anything we do, anything we perceive anew in a way so that we see our assumptions of aloneness in the sense of isolation, our assumptions of fundamental difference are really assumptions, and we get to question them. Is it so that this person at the other end of the world is so very different? Ultimately, is it? Well, let's check it out. We live in a time where we can check it out. And we check it out within as well, the ways we categorize people, the ways we dismiss people, the ways we don't see people. If you think about all the people perhaps in your life that you tend to look through instead of look at. Places where we create an other, not even just through bias or prejudice, but just indifference. Like, who doesn't count? Who doesn't matter? And what happens when you look more carefully? That's all. It's not, trying to exist in like a wash with a certain feeling, but just looking more carefully, seeing things more as they are, is this tremendous opening into that kind of state of connection. And there are ways of actually stretching. It's kind of practicing in certain ways, practicing paying attention differently so that we are putting our attention in a place where these qualities of connection can emerge. The question comes up, what do we pay attention to? If we're thinking about ourselves, are we singularly consumed with just the mistakes we've made? Or can we leave a little room for a bigger picture? Those mistakes may be true. If you come to the end of the day, if you're almost like evaluating yourself, yes, maybe you weren't perfect, but what is the standard of perfection anyway? And what if we only obsess about and are consumed with and captivated by those mistakes to the detriment of there being a more truthful picture? Can we give a little airtime to the other side? Can we? So what do we pay attention to? And who do we pay attention to, as I said before? Who can we look through rather than look at? And how do we pay attention? How present are we? How scattered are we? How much are we looking around the room to see who might be more interesting to talk to? Who have we already decided, oh, well, I heard about you, you're like that. No need to listen. And if we see those things, if we see those habits or we see those tendencies, we can actually relax them or relinquish them and be there in a different way, which is the ground for a certain sense of connection that I'm calling loving kindness. These days I call it love, partly because that's the book title. But actually, people like Bob Thurman, who is a scholar, has, have said to me in the past, like, loving kindness is so quirky a term. Like, what does that mean? You should just say love. And so I'm experimenting clearly with that. Love is a complicated term. What do we mean by love? Sometimes we really, frankly, mean a medium of exchange. I will love you as long as you love me in return, and as long as you evidence that in these 15 ways. I will love myself as long as I never make a mistake. Well, what does that mean, really? We know the fragility of that state and the breakability of that state. But really, we're talking about something that can be more sustained or more renewed, that can really support us. When we talk about loving an other, what does that mean? In some ways, the evolution of this book actually is almost entirely based on one line from a movie, which the movie's called Dan in Real Life. It's maybe now, I don't know, 13, 14 years old, something like that. My goddaughter was in it, so I can kind of place the movie by her. She was really a very little girl then. She just went to college. So the line in the movie is, love is not a feeling, it's an ability. Love is not a feeling, it's an ability. And this is very resonant with what we call loving kindness, or even the state of compassion. Of course, it is a feeling as well, and it's a feeling that, in terms of cultural pressure and conditioning, we yearn for, we want, we identify with, or the lack of with. But think of it for a moment as an ability instead. It's a response mechanism, right? It's a way of being with, it's a worldview. It's a way of being present with ourselves and with others. It's a way of caring, like looking around that subway and thinking we're going to be together forever. So it's a matter of inclusion rather than exclusion. It's seeing the assumptions that come up in one's mind and being willing to question them. Because in the end, it doesn't make that much sense, really. That we don't all want to be happy, that we don't want a sense of belonging, things like that. Love is an ability. And I was very captivated by that line, love is not a feeling, it's an ability, in part because it did so resonate with experiences I had had doing loving kindness meditation. So in addition to just concentration techniques like being with the breath and kind of the stealth cultivation of self-compassion and seeing more clearly and having more insight, there are definitely techniques that are devoted to the deepening of those qualities. And I first did them really intensively when I was in Burma in 1985, doing a 3-month period of practice. And I had a very profound experience when I was there. And I think, like many profound experiences, it doesn't sound like much in words, perhaps, but it really changed a lot for me. And that was some sense that prior to that moment, I had thought of love as a commodity, very much like a package in someone else's hands. And it was in their power to deliver it unto me or to take it away from me. And if someone took it away from me, it was gone. I'd be bereft. There was like no love in my life. It was a little bit like the UPS person standing at my doorstep, looking at the address, thinking, I don't think so, and going the other way. Whereas if I see love as an ability, it's within me, right? It's within my power. And other people or circumstances or art, I mean, so many things might enliven it and awaken that capacity. They might enrich it. They might threaten it. They might make it very, very difficult. But it's not in their hands ultimately, it's in mine. And that was hugely empowering. Love is not a feeling, it's an ability. And that really is the thread that runs throughout this work. So the whole first section of the book is about love for oneself, not in a narcissistic, egotistical sense, of course, which I think narcissism is something very different. And it's not about being self-preoccupied to the exclusion of others, but it's about really seeing ourselves differently. I tell the story in there about seeing a cartoon once from the Peanuts comic strip, and the two characters are Lucy and Charlie Brown, and Lucy says to Charlie Brown, "You know what your problem is? The problem with you is that you're you." And in the second frame, poor Charlie Brown says, "Well, what in the world can I do about that?" Then in the third and final frame, Lucy says, "I don't pretend to be able to give advice. I merely point out the problem." And somehow whenever I was walking by the desk that this cartoon was on, my eye would always fall on that precise line. The problem with you is that you're you. It's like if you really knew who you were, big problem. Because that Lucy dominant voice had been so strong in my earlier life. And I will also say that through particularly mindfulness meditation tools, I'd learned to have a very different relationship to Lucy, which was basically seeing that voice, hearing that message, and being able to respond with, "Hi, Lucy," or "Chill out, Lucy," or "Have a seat, have a cup of tea, just relax." Instead of like, "Oh my God, Lucy's still here. I've been meditating all these years and Lucy's still here. And all that money in therapy and Lucy's still here. What a terrible thing." Or, "You're right, Lucy. You're always right." So that kind of creative domain in between where we can respond very, very differently is really, that's the land of mindfulness right there. So how to relate to ourselves differently? Having a sense almost of a kind of innate dignity that exists within us that we can design our life around and respond to others in the same way. And the second section of the book was really about love for an other, whether it's a partner or a parent or a child or a friend or a colleague or whatever. And when I was first kind of researching the book, I met with a lot of groups and a lot of people. I was really seeking stories and people's experiences. The first time I met with a group, this man raised his hand and he said, "Most people think of a good relationship as 50-50. My dog and I, we're 100-100. And I love that. And the real part comes in that the sense of generosity, connection, caring is real. It's not feigned, it's not coerced, it's not forced. So here's a little section. For example, no matter what we think we should do, I don't think you can coerce yourself into loving your neighbor or your boss when you can't stand them. But if you try to understand your feelings of dislike with mindfulness and compassion, being sure not to forget self-compassion, you create the possibility for change. Your neighbor or your boss may still do things that annoy you, but the anger and tightness you feel in your chest whenever you see them is bound to diminish, leaving you freer and more available for love. This is basically what we do. You know, it's not to try to pretend in any way, although I'm sure this man really loved his dog more than anything. You know, it's not to enter a state of hypocrisy or pretense, or certainly not to try to force yourself into anything, but it's awakening to different possibilities. You know what it's like when you're sure you know somebody, and then you find out something about them, and it's like, that's a surprise. And the sense of almost like awe that happens in that moment, like, whoa, who could have guessed? I didn't know you did that, or I didn't know whatever. I also tell a story in the book about assumptions and how a friend of mine who's a writer gave a talk somewhere, and he, in the context of the talk, he spoke about Proust and reading Proust and Remembrances of Things Past, which had been a very important book for him when he was in college. And afterwards, he was having dinner somewhere, and this woman came up to him and said, "Oh, I was at your talk," and his heart sank because he immediately had a judgment about her. He thought, well, she's probably really poorly educated, and she doesn't look that smart. And then she said to him, "The thing is, I find reading Proust in the original French much more fulfilling." And it was like, oh, okay, there you go. So it's actually a tremendous sense of discovery and exploration to experiment with how we pay attention so that we can actually open and we can actually listen. And then the whole third section of the book is about love for all beings and love for life itself. And this is really interesting. In some ways, it's almost more interesting these days than it has been. It's very interesting. And difficult, of course, and demands a tremendous amount of understanding. Like, what do we mean? Do we mean complacency? Do we mean compliance? Do we mean acquiescence? Do we mean a kind of liberated understanding that's not so afraid, that isn't holding ourselves or others in a kind of prison of certainty? What do we mean? Because certainly if it means liking everybody, that makes no sense. In fact, the last group that I did, as I was trying to collect people's stories and things like that, somebody said to me, in my life, it was always said, or it was just the assumption that loving somebody was a supreme, rare, rarefied, precious, unusual way of relating. Whereas you liked everybody. I mean, you just like people. It's much lower. And he said, you're reversing it. You're turning it around. You're saying, yeah, we can love everybody, but liking somebody, that's rare, perhaps. And I thought about it, and I said, you're right, I am. Because it's not love in the sense of I want to spend tremendous time with you, I want to spend my life with you. It's not romance. It's not even saying, yeah, let's go to the movies. It's that fundamental sense of acknowledging connection and realizing we're kind of all in this together, like we're all the traffic. That's love, as the way I'm using the word. And you may not like somebody at all, and you may decide, you know what? It's not in the sense of a balanced kind of compassion, including myself. It's not in the cards right now that we're going to spend any time together. That's just not right. Or my best guess of the most appropriate way, the most skillful way to relate in this moment is strong boundaries. It's kind of a fierce message. It's tough love. There's all kinds of possibilities in terms of how we actualize our relationship. But that inner sense of feeling, okay, we're kind of all in this together. What's it like? What would it be like to be you? To translate some difficult actions into actions that are produced by pain, that cause more pain and suffering. To really stretch, to examine and be creative about the ways that we relate. Open us to the possibility of loving everybody, even if we don't like everyone very much. So I also tell the story in the book about once spending time with this man named Miles Horton, who founded a school many years ago called the Highlander Folk School. I think it still exists, but it has a different name now, in Tennessee. And it was like a training school for the civil rights movement in the U.S. and the very early environmental movement. And so he and I ended up spending a day together, and I talked to him about loving kindness meditation, and he sort of snorted at me, and he said, Martin Luther King Jr., Marty used to say to me all the time, you got to love everybody. And I say, no, I don't. I only have to love the people that deserve to be loved. And Marty would laugh and say, no, you got to love everybody. And prior to this book, I so rarely told that story. But I remembered that every time I told the story, somebody would come back at me and say something like, well, look what happened to him. You know, he got assassinated. As though it was the love that weakened him, right? And if he'd been vicious and angry and hostile and hateful, he would have been safe. He wouldn't have been vulnerable to anyone else's actions. And I think that projection of causality is very interesting. Look at that. So the fundamental question is, what do we think love is? And does it bring us down? Does it make us stupid? Does it make us sentimental? Or can it be this kind of clarifying vision of really the way the world actually is and how we can respond to it? So how about if we sit together for a few minutes and then we'll just have some time for questions. Okay. So since I introduced it as my first technique, we can also go back there. And I'd say, see if you can settle your attention on the feeling of the breath, just the normal, natural breath, however it's appearing for you. You don't have to try to make it deeper or different. And watch your mind at the moment that you realize you're thinking about dinner or your vacation or whatever it is. See how you speak to yourself. And if that is a pretty harsh voice, kind of punitive, belittling, you can recognize that. See if you can soften that response. Remember that our goal is to just let go and begin again. If you have to do that billions of times, that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. You're doing fine. Okay, so you can just find the place where the breath is clearest for you or strongest for you. Maybe that's the nostrils or the chest or the abdomen. Bring your attention there and just rest. See if you can feel one breath. Remember, the most important moment is the moment after you've been distracted, after you've been lost. No matter how many times you may have to let go and begin again, it's not a problem. That's the point, actually. And I'll close with this passage from the book. Today, with unprecedented threats to our planet and divisions among people, awareness of our interdependence is no longer optional. It's critical that we widen our attention to include those we encounter as we go about our daily lives, including our dry cleaner and the strangers sitting next to us on the subway. We extend our sense of inclusion even further to people we may have disagreements with, people whose actions we disapprove of, even those who may have harmed us or those we care for. We don't have to like what they've done, and we might take very strong action to try to prevent their doing it ever again. But as our experiences of the universality of suffering grows, our sense of interconnection deepens, and we begin to wish others could be free in a new way, in spite of their actions, their beliefs, or their positions in the world. So thank you. So thank you.
And we'll open up to questions. So does anyone in the room want to start us off with a question?
Oh, wow. What is love?
You don't have to.
Well, I mean, my guess would be, or my interpretation might be like that kind of unconditional acceptance of self and other, like you were suggesting, or compatible with what you described. I'm curious, so, I think about here at Google, we have a kind of like pragmatic kind of problem-solving approach. When we see a problem, when we see metrics, in search or whatever, we try to understand, like, okay, this is what the problem, here are the details of the problem, and then brainstorm different possible solutions.
Yeah.
And so in what I'm hearing you say, you're describing these kinds of states or qualities of awareness in terms of a kind of acceptance, a kind of interconnectedness.
Yeah.
And so these other kinds of like aspects to or qualities of our experience. And then you're also distinguishing like breathing meditation as a technique that guides us to that, or loving kindness meditation.
Yeah.
Do you see, are those like the only, so this is what I'm trying to tease apart. It's like, are those the only practices that can guide us to those kinds of states of consciousness or awareness?
No, I think those are far, far from the only practices that guide us to that. I mean, they're actually interactive practices. I mean, there's that as an example. If you're talking about reflection and meditation, there are many others as well. But, as part of Search Inside Yourself, there's Just Like Me, which is that intentional looking at someone else and recognizing, oh, that's a person just like me, wants to be happy just like me, who has, maybe backaches just like me, or, whatever it might be. There are ways we learn to look at one another differently. Certainly the ways we learn to listen, which are actual disciplines in communication. And, there are many, there's so many ways of looking at what may be a kind of manufactured sense of limitation and being able to dissolve that into seeing things differently.
In terms of like separation or scarcity.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'll ask you to a follow-up question about that. Of how do you suggest people choose or like decide, or do you just encourage people to try out the different techniques, or do you have other guidance for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're in a place as you are here, where there actually could be both a sense of community exploration and guidance, because one of the great hindrances people face is their expectations. And to have a voice, however it comes, to say, wait a minute, it's okay that your mind wandered, for example, which is one of the great bugaboos of meditation practices, people who feel like utterly aghast that their mind, that they had a thought, because they think that's not supposed to happen. I failed. Countless people say to me, if I'm introduced as a meditation teacher, I tried that once, I failed at it. And, well, what happened, actually? So I believe in structure and that kind of learning, just to have a sense of context. Like there's a body of knowledge, and you are in a place where you can access that body of knowledge here. And that's all, is to have that. And then The rest, it's interesting. It's like alchemy. We have to do something. It's not just fondly thinking, these are good values to live by. Or sometimes it hasn't happened. My book is actually not out yet. It's coming out June 6th. So it hasn't happened yet. But many times, because there are meditation practices and techniques in all of my books, people will say to me, I'm buying your book for my cousin. I could never do this. But they really need it. They're so stressed out. So what is that sense of separation from actually putting it into practice? That's the hardest part, is saying, it's a practice, or it's a series of practices. And that means application and exploration, and it means continuity, because it's not always going to be easy, So if you're willing to do that, then I think it all happens.
My question is, I'm a little reluctant to say because it's not well formulated in my head, but I'm thinking about parents and children. I'm having a conversation with my 23-year-old son today, and I'm going to stretch and have a different kind of approach after listening to you. But I'm thinking about love in terms of, there's the love as you're describing is connection and not feeling separate, but in relationships, particularly with parents and children, that what would be the proper way of describing love where you acknowledge the separateness, that we are separate. Yeah. There are no expectations. You're not mine.
Yeah. I don't know that I said or meant to say we're not separate. We're not isolated. We're not kind of bound in this rigid sense of exclusion, but certainly we're separate, which is why a true state of love might sometimes mean strong boundaries, or might mean, no, I'm not giving you any more money, or no, you can't move in, or whatever. We're not going to spend any time together. Of course, we're separate in those ways. And you're right, it's a complicated, intricate, amazing kind of relationship. Also in that first group that I did where the man said he and his dog were 100, somebody was talking about her relationship with her son, who I think was about the same age as your son. And she said, I think your book should be called Real Love, Simple but Not Easy. Because, it's not easy. There's a certain, it's like a funny combination, I think, of loving and letting go, which is the hallmark of a relationship with an adult child. And it's funny, I was doing a Skype session with a friend. I was on the East Coast, and they were in California. It was a friend's yoga teacher training group. And I was talking about, within the Buddhist tradition, there's this term called equanimity, which doesn't mean indifference. It doesn't mean coldness or withdrawal. It means balance. And it's the balance born of wisdom. It's like perspective. In any compassionate act, or the examples often used in that tradition of a parent with an adult child. You love them, you care about them, you're on their side, you want things to go well for them, and you can't make their decisions for them. You can't say, well, this is your livelihood, and this is your partner, and this is, your course of life. Life is not like that. And so it's not apathy or rejection, but it's a kind of understanding that gives us a sense of space, like being able to breathe. So it's a combination of the love and compassion and also that kind of openness. So apparently there were a lot of people in this room in the yoga teacher training program who had young children. And they were like clamoring to say, it's like that with young kids too. It's not just when they're adults, it's just like that. So it's kind of an extension of that understanding. And, sometimes we're on one side, and sometimes we're on the other side, and it's just being aware of that and learning how to communicate. There's no easy feat anywhere. How do you communicate to a colleague? How do you communicate to a person you're supervising? Clearly, there are some tools that are kind of somewhat cliched maybe or formulaic, but actually work. Like, if you're supervising someone, it's not that useful to say you're an idiot. it's much more useful to say, well, when the memo, 6 weeks late or whatever, because you're an idiot actually doesn't even give that person the information they need should they want to change, right? So we learn how to communicate in a way that it's more expressive of, okay, being on the same side, wanting you to, yeah. Simple but not easy.
Yeah. Question over here.
Do you think love or connection can happen without empathy?
Can it happen without empathy?
Can you have it without empathy? It seems like empathy is such a key part, which
Yeah.
is part of compassion.
Yeah.
But I didn't really hear you use the word empathy.
No, I didn't use the word empathy at all. I think empathy is in there somewhere along the way, for sure. We would say that empathy is like an essential building block for, say, a state of compassion, but it's also not considered sufficient for a state of compassion, because you may have a kind of moment of empathy towards someone's situation. Let's say they're having a hard time and you sense that and you feel that, you resonate with that. You might genuinely have that moment of empathy, but then respond with fear. Or you're just exhausted and you think, I'm so burnt out, I can't possibly deal. Or you might be blaming. I gave you perfectly good advice 6 months ago. If you'd only listened, you'd be better off. Or in the state of compassion, it also might get blurred with that kind of savior mentality, like I'm going to be the one who's going to fix you. Or we might respond with compassion, and loving kindness. So there are a lot of elements in there, but I think empathy is essential.
Okay, it sounds like empathy isn't as sustaining. What deeper is compassion?
I think it's different, So in psychological research, they say that we might, the way they put it is we might have this state of empathy, and we need this state of empathy. We do need it, you're right. But we might over-identify with the other person, so it's not like we're looking at them thinking I can sense what it might be like for you. It's like we're there. And then it's like we're going down with the ship, So they say that empathy leads to empathic distress, where our own feeling of being overwhelmed with negativity is what's taken over. So there's not like room for that kind of generosity and stability of the loving response.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
One last question. It sounds like you've done Vipassana meditation.
Yeah.
Okay, and you studied in Burma. And is a lot of this book based on the attributes and the learnings of Vipassana?
Well, Vipassana, it's a kind of complicated question. Vipassana is a term in Pali, language of the original Buddhist text. It means insight. It means insight. So Vipassana meditation is insight meditation. And there are like many, many, many strands and techniques and traditions and lineages within that. Goenka, S.N. Goenka, who was my first teacher, was kind of an early teacher in modern time outside of Burma, which was a very closed country. When I first went to India, you could go to Burma for 24 hours. But he had left Burma and he was in India, so he called his particular style, his particular technique Vipassana. So even it has a much broader meaning, but most people identify it with that one way of practice. So, and when I went to Burma, it wasn't within his tradition. I was studying with other people by then. But he was my first teacher, so it was a hugely important relationship. Yeah.
I have a question. Well, first, my definition of what is love. I was thinking about that. I was like, I'd say it's so I think what I'm thinking is just self-acceptance of all wholeness. So like my dark sides, my light sides, everything from the past to the present and what will be. And it isn't easy. So like that's my definition. So my question is just around the term love. So I liked what you said about Bob Thurman. And Bob Thurman is coming here, by the way, in September 12th.
Oh, how great.
In this room, I think. Yeah, so he's talking about his new book called Man of Peace, about Dalai Lama. So my question was around the word because I think there's a lot of triggers with love and loving kindness. I like the abbreviation of just using love. I'm going to start using that too. But do you think it's overused? Because
Love?
yeah, the word love. In terms of like my thought is it loses meaning over time. Like anything, if you just say it all the time. So like, how do you know? Like if I love you, it's like, is that the same? Or can you share more about that? Because I'm always struggling. I don't want to say love unless it's really real, but at the same time, I want to express. So what do I do? Or what can we do?
We can call it real love, I guess.
I'll just say real love.
No, it's very difficult. Of course, it's overused. You know, I love my manicure. You know, I love my lamp. I love my new car, sort of, not totally, but I would have loved it more if it was the other color that I asked for, but it was, the second choice. But I still love it. You know, so of course we use it in so many ways. I think that in looking back over my work, in the world, and now this is my 10th book, I realize that something that fascinates me and that has moved me a lot has actually been redeeming words. That so many words get kind of denigrated or used in strange ways or take on new meanings, and I think we lose something when we lose the word. Like, I read a book called Faith, so that was a challenge. Even my friends were aghast, like, why are you writing a book on that? Because for so many people, faith had come to mean being silenced and not being able to ask questions and not having a voice of your own, and of course it didn't mean that to me. And so I thought, okay, if we can take back that word, we can perhaps, if it's meaningful to someone in a different way. So I had a feeling I might be trying to do something like that with love. Because if we use it in a certain way, not like I love my new car, but not totally because it's the wrong color, then I think we recapture the power of that in that way.
When you told the two stories, one about traffic and the other about being on the airplane, what do you think it takes to get to where you have those realizations on, like, throughout the day, right?
Yeah.
I know people use the word triggered, which I'm starting to find overused.
Yeah.
But, for you, or even, for
Yeah.
you, I'm curious, and then also advice for other people,
Yeah.
right? How do you remember everybody else exists and the other is not the other, and, the situation is what it is? I mean, what is that? How does that, what do you think on that?
I think the meditation exercise we did is like a fractal of the whole path, in that you won't remember throughout the day, but you can begin again, right? And talking about words, like at the end of a workshop, the end of a retreat, the end of a program, people often say, well, how can I keep the level of concentration I got here? How can I maintain the level of mindfulness I got here? And my usual response is you won't, but you can start again. You can start again more gracefully. You can start again with less like glue, with better humor, with more kindness towards yourself. You can start again sooner, and that's what happens. Of course we forget. I mean, we're just human beings.
After everything you've done, and as long as you've done this, do you feel some of that comes naturally to you?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but that doesn't mean every moment of the day, like...
Assure us that you have some bad moments.
I have some bad moments, thank you. When I was a couple of trips ago leaving San Francisco for New York, my flight was 6.5 hours late. And I was fine for the first 5.5 hours. I was like good humor. I was sending loving kindness throughout the airport, the whole thing. At hour 5.5, I started to lose it. And just then, somebody came up to me and said, "Are you Sharon Salzberg?" I thought, oh.
It's funny.
I was so close to having a temper tantrum on the ground, like.
You can start again is
Came
a great
over.
message. Yeah. So
Sharon Salzberg, right? Yeah.
thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me.